Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SourceForge Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Bo Hamilton, Senior Editor and Multimedia Producer here at SourceForge, the world's most visited software comparison site where B2B software buyers compare and find business software solutions. Today, we're talking with Dane Boyd, Lead Security Awareness Consultant for Fortra's Terranova Security. In the simplest of terms, this company helps businesses of all size train their employees on how to spot and handle cyber threats. And they also help businesses with regulatory compliance, which is an increasingly complex area to navigate. So without further ado, let me introduce Dane Boyd. Dane, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Before we jump into some of the nitty gritty details of cybersecurity, could you introduce yourself and give us an overview of your company?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is actually in marketing and sales, and so which may be a non-traditional background for someone in the cybersecurity industry. But for me, it worked out really well, specifically for what I do. Like I said, I got a degree in marketing in college, and then went into the sales world. But during that path, I crossed paths with a cybersecurity company and got fascinated by the cybersecurity industry. And it was really interesting to see how cyber criminals are working, the threats that organizations really face, and then I realized that a good cybersecurity awareness training program is all about change, and which is the same thing marketing was. I'm trying to change people's behavior, get them to adopt a new product or buy a new product. In sales, it was trying to convince someone to change where they spend their money, what businesses they trust. And so when I went through your traditional cybersecurity awareness training programs in my former employers, they were kind of dull, kind of boring. And I realized there's an opportunity for someone with a marketing background to make change. And so I've been in cybersecurity since 2014, and specifically in the cybersecurity and training world, and have enjoyed it ever since. And so really my goal is to make people change their mind, but do it in an effective way, which usually means making an engaging program. And so I'm excited to be a part of the Terranova family. So Terranova has been around for quite a long time, I think 20 years now, and it has been a leader in the cybersecurity space. We're now part of the larger organization, Fortra. Fortra and the Terranova company together are really designed to help organizations meet their business needs when it comes to compliance, automation, and security. And so, the Terranova security family has a great suite of products that can make things easier for our clients.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that introduction. It's always neat to hear about how you end up in your position, from the marketing and sales role to really just finding interest in cybersecurity and that industry. I think should be pretty clear and increasingly clear throughout this podcast that Terranova Security is really dedicated to helping organizations sort of tackle, I would say, the human side of cybersecurity. Speaking of that, what would you say are the key components of an effective security awareness training program, and how do you sort of prioritize those elements when building a curriculum?
Yeah, you're right. The people side, it actually plays a really big part, right? So computers would never get hacked if there weren't people using them. And so if you unplugged everything, your organization will be 100% safe. And so unfortunately, it's not effective. And so whenever you're creating a cybersecurity awareness program, it really is helping those people become part of your defense. The human firewall, a term we hear often. And so in order to create an effective cybersecurity awareness training program, you really need to know your organization's needs and then also know your audience. And then with that information, you can plan accordingly. Some of the challenges we see that organizations, they'll buy simply a tool, but yet don't really have a solution. They have shelfware. They paid a license for some piece of software to help them meet their goals, but it doesn't get used. We have other organizations that are struggling because they only require the minimum requirements. They're told that they have to do an annual security training and they have to do an annual phishing assessment, and that's where they end. And yet their organization is still at risk for cyber criminals have not really truly reduced that risk. And then we also see organizations that really don't understand their audience, and they don't really create those effective, engaging training paths for their employees. And so ultimately, the people aren't any better because they go through boring training that just doesn't really grab their attention, and so they're really not learning. The way I look at this is actually kind of going back to the idea of marketing is Old Spice. So I don't know if you remember 2009, but Old Spice was a brand that was struggling. and the market was saturated. And they came up with an ad campaign because they realized a key thing about their audience. They realized that most 60% of their buyers were actually women and not men. So where historically they were marketing to the men, they realized they needed to market to the women. So they made an ad campaign called "The Man Your Man Can Smell Like." The Man Your Man Can Smell Like, I think is what it was called. The Man Your Man Can Smell Like. Had Isaiah Mustafa as the spokesperson, and it starts out, the first campaign that they put out was compelling, and it spoke to their audience, the women, right? It was, look at me, look at your man, now look back at me, look back at your man, right? And we went on this whole monologue that was compelling women to say that, hey, your man, although he can't look like me, could smell like me. And it was extremely effective. And we saw that when this brand understood who their audience was, they were able to drive sales. So I think within 3 days, they had 20 million views on YouTube. A month later, they were the number one brand on YouTube. And then 4 months later, they had a 120% increase in sales. All of that from targeting their actual audience, right? And so as we're creating cybersecurity awareness programs, we really need to know our audience, know their needs. And so when we do that, when it comes to knowing your needs, really a good cybersecurity awareness training program is going to start with planning. So you need to understand why you're doing the program. Is it compliance requirements? Is it industry needs? Are you dealing with things like PII or PCI? Are you dealing with technology changes? Are you moving to the cloud, or do you have more people that are remote than before? Is your industry facing increased cyber threats? And so with that information, you can design a program to help you figure out what's important and what you need to train on. And then when you look at your employees, right? So going back to the idea of knowing your employees, you really need to know how you can best reach them. What does your workforce look like? How do they learn? And how can you best teach them the things that they need to know? Right? For example, we see that as the younger people are continuing to enter the workforce, the traditional cybersecurity awareness training, or traditional training in general, really doesn't work. They want stuff that's more engaging. They don't want to read. They want to have videos instead of reading material. And so really you have to make an adjustment to that to be able to reach your audience. And so companies that have very successful cybersecurity programs, really that's one thing they do really well. They know their audience, they know their need, they know their business, why they're doing it, and they know who their audience is, and they're able to reach them.
That's a lot of great info there. There's a couple things I want to note. Well, first of all, the Old Spice commercial, I mean, that ad campaign, I feel like it was just yesterday, and I wish they'd bring it back, because it was such an engaging campaign. I'd always look forward to the newest kind of episode, series during Super Bowl or whatever it might be. Super engaging. Also, it makes me think, knowing your audience, it makes me think of like the content creation, YouTube side of things. It's just kind of like more of my backstory and previous experience lies, because knowing what content to create and who it's for is huge. I mean, that is what it's all about. And that's really how it helps you grow and become more successful in whatever it might be, whether it's the messaging or, growing your audience. You gotta know who you're engaging with. When it comes to designing these programs of yours, how do you strike a balance between meeting, like, let's say, compliance requirements and also addressing the real world security needs of an organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a 16-year-old who just got a driver's license. And for those of you who have gone through that, know that is a potentially harrowing experience, right? It can be terrifying. And ultimately, teaching your child to drive ends in a driver's test, right? And then once they pass that driver's test, they're able to drive, and you're probably a little more afraid than you were before to get out there on the road when you realize who's out there with you. But when it comes to teaching your child to drive, you could simply teach them to pass the test, right? And growing up where I took my driver's test out in the country of the country area of Georgia, a little more rural, it was the simplest driving test you could imagine. It was drive around a block, go into a parking lot, parallel park, and I use that term loosely, and then go back to the testing center, and that was it. And had my parents taught me that, yes, I could have passed the test, I could have dropped my driver's license, but they would not have prepared me to actually be an effective and a safe driver around the world, right? They wouldn't have prepared me for driving in different conditions or anticipating the dangers. And so likewise, our security training has to equip people for the real world challenges and not just pass the compliance test. And so compliance really is kind of a starting point for a training program, but it's definitely not the end. And so you should use compliance as a starting point for your program. And if you do a good program, that'll be a natural outcome, but it's not really the goal. So one of the things that Terranova talks about is the 5-step program to help make a security awareness program. Step 1 is to analyze. And in that step, it really is understanding the why behind things and what you have to teach. So making sure your content is aligned with compliance is critical. Obviously you want to make sure that when you have auditors come in, that you're meeting all the requirements that are there. You want to make sure you don't miss anything. And then you also want to understand which audience need additional trainings, right? So for those that are dealing with PCI, people that are using the payment card transactions and terminals and things are going to need additional training, where someone in marketing may not. And so you have to know that information going into it so you can plan accordingly. And if you know that information and you've got the right content, then you're not going to miss anything. You'll be compliant, but you'll also be able to be effective in your training program and go beyond that.
Okay, yeah, that first example you mentioned makes me think of sort of like the dichotomy between street smarts and book smart, where you can read up, in detail about a subject, but until you're actually like living it and experiencing it in the real world, you don't get a full understanding of the concepts or whatever it might be. So that's I appreciate that example of the driver's license, because we've all been there. We know the struggles, we know like what to look out for. But I would just say in general, it seems like you focus on the security needs of an organization, the compliance requirements, I would say come easy. You think they would come easy since you're already covering what employees need to know. But, as you mentioned, it's not quite that simple. I want to focus specifically on risk assessments now. In cybersecurity, a risk assessment is basically a way for companies to figure out the threats and the vulnerabilities they might encounter. And they help break down the impact of each threat so businesses can make educated decisions on how to protect their systems and their data. Dane, could you discuss the role of risk assessments in shaping the content and the focus of security awareness training?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to what you were just saying about the difference between street smarts and book smarts. And a knowledge assessment, a risk assessment really allows you to figure out what the actual threats are that you're facing. It's where the rubber meets the road. And so you're able to focus on the things that really matter, and you're preparing for things that actually matter. And so it's just that. So understanding what risk your organization face, and that can be done through a variety of different means. It could be an internal analysis. It could be analysis on your individuals. It could be a survey of your employees, understand what they need, what they know, what they don't know. It could be consulting with other business stakeholders and other leaders in the organization. It could be from other internal assessments or audits, for example, individual metrics. So all these things can come together and create a risk assessment to help you figure out what are your biggest threats. Because while there are theoretical threats that could impact your organization, if you have a company that's 100% remote, talking about a secure office is probably a lower priority than talking about, phishing emails, for example. Most people aren't going to let a stranger into their house and walk around in their office. So understanding your employees and what risk your organization faces is critical. So you're focusing your efforts efficiently and effectively. And so really that's what it comes down to. It's just that. It's focusing on the things that matter the most.
Gotcha. Well, one challenge I know a lot of companies face is getting employees to actually care about security training. Whether that's because it's required and many people don't like to be told what to do, or whether it's the subject matter can be a little bit dry or like tedious to get through. How do you engage employees who might be resistant or maybe indifferent to security training?
So looking at my background, that's really what got me interested in cybersecurity in the first place, is the idea that that you can actually teach people, but you have to make it interesting. And so, yeah, you mentioned the material is dry, and there are things you can do about that to make it more engaging. And so I think there are good opportunities out there, and there are good partners like Terranova Security to help make the content more interesting. But beyond that, we have to acknowledge that when it comes to employees being resistant to change, that's not new. Change is hard. I'm sure, I know that I have been part of the resistance to change. I've grumbled and complained when there are changes that were needed to be made. And so we really need to understand, the different phases of a change, what we need to do to get people through that change in order to be effective. There's an acronym, ADKAR, that kind of talks about how we implement change. It's a method for change. So it's awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And so as we implement change, we need to understand where employees are in those phases and be able to address them or meet them where they're at. So when it comes to awareness, employees really need to know why it matters. We need to empathize with them that we are asking them to do something else on top of everything else they have to do. Someone in marketing or in sales or, finance, whatever, they might not see themselves as really part of the security posture of the company, but they really are. They really are part of the human firewall. And so if we can make sure the employees understand that, it can dampen the amount of resistance that you get. And so if you have employees that are stuck at that phase, it really is about communication, right? If there are people that are being resistant and they're just at the awareness phase, it really is that communication. You need to explain why what they're doing impacts them. For example, I had a client who was having a lot of issues with people downloading malware to the computer, right? So they get on their work computer and they do personal searches, and it would result in malware, computer viruses, and things being downloaded on their machines. And so the way they combated that was by explaining to them individuals that they in fact have an impact on the organization. They gave examples of how there were issues based on their actions or these actions. And then they created a policy that anyone who got a computer virus on their machine while browsing would have their their internet history turned over to their boss for the last 6 months. Last 6 months of their search history would given to the boss. And so that can be an interesting conversation piece for sure. And so it definitely increase awareness, make people have a vested interest in following the policies and for this company, keeping their work computers limited to work use. And so that's one thing when it comes to that. So, and then when we get to the desire stage, right? So let's assume you've got people past the awareness. They understand why they need to do it, but they just don't care. They're empathetic about it. And so really it's all about getting people excited about the change. And so we can do this by explaining to them the importance of their change and why they need to be participate in that. I had a client who had a large competitor, one of their biggest local competitors, get breached and had a ransomware attack, and it created a lot of headaches and a lot of stir. But that was a compelling moment to get people involved and understand that their actions actually have a serious impact on the company and its ability to be profitable and successful. And so, if you have people stuck at the desire, you really got to help them see the light and help them understand the why. So going through that ADKAR acronym, when it comes to knowledge, you have to provide the information to change, right? You can't tell them that they can't click on suspicious links if you don't ever teach them what a suspicious link is. So this is where the security awareness program really needs to fill in the gaps and provide them the information of how. A lot of people are willing to change if they understood how, right? And so we need to be clear on our expectations and definitions. And then when it comes to ability, really it is a matter of making sure, again, they have the ideas, they have the information that they need, and then reinforcement. One of the challenges that we see organizations do, they look at cybersecurity awareness training as a one-time deal. Once a year, they do their training, and that's it. And really, people don't learn that way. I think there's a very small percentage of information that's actually retained after a training session. And so if you leave it to one time a year, people aren't going to remember it. And so you have to have repetition. You have to reinforce it throughout the year to have an effective program. And so that's kind of one thing you can do when looking at people that are resistant to change is understand their motives, understand why they are resistant to the change, figure out where they are in those phases, and then help address them specifically based on their needs.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's I think just reiterating the kind of the consequences too of not changing for the better and not implementing various security tactics is huge. Because if this is happening to the big companies, this is happening to smaller organizations all around the world and specifically in the US. So it's a real big issue, as you're well aware.
Yeah, just to add to that, I was at a speaking event it was a large regional bank. and it was a meeting for some of their larger clients. So mostly small businesses. I mean, most of them weren't brand names that you would recognize. And during that session, I asked the question, who's dealt with ransomware in the last 24 months or last 12 months? And it was shocking to see every hand go up in that room. And so, yeah, you definitely get the big publicity around the big companies, the big brands, the name brands, but it is far more impactful than what we realize by just reading the headlines.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, that's shocking. Now, let's say you get an organization to implement these security training, you get employees to engage with it and follow through with it. How do you measure the effectiveness of the program? Like, what metrics are you looking at to show that it's actually working?
Yeah, so a lot of cybersecurity awareness programs have two components. It has training, so course material, and then it'll have some sort of assessment. So those assessments could be phishing simulation, a vishing simulation, smishing, something along those lines. And a lot of companies, that's kind of where they start in their reporting. Are the courses being completed? So what's that completion rate? And then what's the performance on the simulations or whatever that tactical assessment is? Phishing simulation, vishing, etc. But really, an effective cybersecurity awareness program is going to have to go above and beyond that, right? The goal of a good program is to mitigate the risk, to reduce your risk in an organization. And how do you measure that? Certainly, clicking links in suspicious emails is one of those things, and we're able to see that from a simulation perspective. But there is other information across your organization that can give you a better clue of how things are going. So, how many alerts are you getting from your firewall from employees engaging with suspicious links and emails? How many instances of computer viruses are you dealing with? How many times are you getting alerts that people are trying to access bad websites? Are you seeing people trying to circumvent the security protocols that you have in place? And so those pieces of information can really give you a better picture of what's going on in your organization and if your training's effective. And we've seen clients do this super effective by aggregating data across different tools, using information from their secure operating centers to their simulations and training program, and be able to aggregate that. They're actually able to see that when everything is going well in their training program, their awareness program, that the number of threats that the organization facing is actually going down. So they actually are reducing their risk. And so, I would recommend every organization consider looking beyond just the click rate or just the course completion rate, and create a holistic picture to identify your risk and measure it to make sure it's going down.
Now, once you figure out the metrics to look out for and some of the possible, knowledge gaps that exist, I imagine the next step would be to tailor the right training for the right employee, the right organization. And you mentioned some of the examples already, but can you share any more on how you adjust your training programs for employees who, have different levels of security knowledge and risk behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some obvious ones. The payment card industry, DSS, data security standards, is definitely one of those ones. It's pretty obvious. If you deal with payment card information, you got to do PCI training. So that's one of the obvious ones. But I think that within every organization, there are going to be different roles that are more public facing than others. And so understanding an individual's risk score, or risk tolerance based on who they are, their role, how they interact with the public, how they interact outside the company, is a great way to figure out who needs additional training. I'll give you an example, and I tell you this as a recovering salesperson, that salespeople can be very eager to open emails and click links in emails to find out what's on the other side of that. Generally, we embrace risk, and so that can be bad from a security posture perspective. And so I had a client that wanted to reduce the risk that their sales reps presented to the organization. And so we created an individual curriculum for the sales reps. So it was targeted phishing emails tailored just towards them. And then the results of that were shared in a sales training program during one of their annual trainings. And so they got this additional training where they were able to see the results of their individual team and how well they did, and then get that follow-up training that they needed to explain how they identify a legitimate email versus a suspicious one. And immediately saw the impact on the sales team and people really getting on board with the idea that, yeah, if I fell for this simulation, I could probably fall for something a little more sophisticated. And so, so that's just again, another example of how we can do that. So if we can develop a risk profile based on the department or the responsibilities or how public an individual is, we can create a training program for those individuals so that they are is tailor-made for what they do. Someone in HR has very different responsibilities than someone who is an IT developer, both of whom play a very key role in the overall posture of cybersecurity for that organization. And so thinking about that is really what it's going to come down to: understanding your individual employees, grouping them best you can, and then creating a training path or training curriculum for them specifically. So just as a note, one of the things that I think often gets overlooked is the risk that new hires pose to an organization. And so I would recommend treating your new hires as a special training group that gets a little bit extra attention than your other people that have been there for a while. Your new hires, they pose a bigger risk because they don't really know the norms of the company, right? They don't know necessarily what file sharing services are allowed and what aren't. They don't know whether you get a voicemail sent to your email as an attached MP3, MP4 video, whatever. They don't know all those things. And so they're more likely to fall for phishing emails. And we've seen that with simulations. For example, I had a client that had a business that was very seasonal. And so they had a lot of turnover. And when it came to their simulations and failure rate, they were able to get down to about 7% failure rate, which was pretty good, but they couldn't get below that. And after doing some analysis on who's failing, what it turned out, it was all the new hires, right? So you get new hires in, they'd fail a lot in the simulations. Over time, that failure rate would go down because they'd be trained up. Then it was time to replace them, or they would go away, and then you get the next season, more new hires, the failure rates would spike back up. And so, new hires is one of those groups that really do need an individual curriculum in order to mitigate the risk that they pose to your organization. So that's really it. You got to understand your employees, understand the different risks that they have based on all those different factors I mentioned, and then create a curriculum for each of them.
Yeah, no, I can totally see how new employees would be kind of a vulnerability for companies, right? Because they're getting set up. So I could see that being an issue. I'm curious about the organization as a whole, maybe on a macro level. Like, what are some common pitfalls organizations face when implementing security awareness training, and how do you recommend they avoid them?
Yeah, the two that come to mind, not measuring performance is one of them. We kind of touched on that earlier, but then also not maximizing on momentum. So to touch on each of those quickly, the idea of not measuring performance. My first real boss when I got my first real job after college, his name was Mark, and he always told me, you got to inspect what you expect. And while I didn't appreciate it at the time, it's definitely something that I've come to embrace. And so when you do a cybersecurity awareness program, it really is about having effective measures to see if you're succeeding or failing. And if there are weaknesses, you need to be able to know that so you can shore them up. And so that's one thing that comes to mind. The other part of it is not continuing on momentum. If you've got a favorite band, I don't know, Green Day, Blink-182, Taylor Swift, Metallica, I don't know. If you've got a band that you love, you're probably more likely to buy one of their shirts at a concert than at the Walmart or Spencer's or whatever it is, right? And so you really have to, and that's because there's momentum there. And so whenever you make a change for a cybersecurity program, you really have to capture the momentum. I've seen companies struggle with this where they announce like, hey, we've got the cybersecurity awareness program. It's super important. They get people hyped up. They get people believing that it really matters, but then they don't follow through. The courses don't get assigned. The simulations don't happen. I had a client for 3 years. I was presenting for them this hype up program, and every year we told them, hey, we're giving you a button that you can report suspicious emails, and it's going to play a big part in our cyber security and our security posture. And every year I was telling them the same thing. And so, people were losing the momentum that was created by these kickoff meetings, for example. And so whenever you do have a training event or you ever do create some momentum, you really have to follow up on that. You really have to keep the momentum going. So for example, that could mean, when you do a phishing simulation, send a follow-up communication to let people know how they did. If they pass the simulation, let them know, congratulate them. If they fail a simulation, let them know again that they failed, and provide them those useful tips that they can learn from. Giving them reinforcement lessons for leaders. So letting the leaders know what they can do to help reinforce the success and or shore up the failures. And then, of course, tracking and celebrating success. One of the companies I worked for in the past was a high tech company, very security focused, and they encourage employees to report suspicious emails to this specific mailbox, where we had some of the greatest analysts in the industry that would look at them, determine if they're a threat, and action them and take care of them. But it became a bit of a black hole, and so people weren't really excited about it. I know I had an experience once where I got a pretty compelling phishing email. I reported it to them, and because of the nature of the threat, I actually had them reach out to me and get me involved, and we had to take some actions together. And it actually made it exciting. It actually motivated me to be part of that. And so whenever you are encouraging people to take behaviors, you really need to reinforce it, right? Don't just let it die on the vine. Encourage that behavior by capturing that momentum. And so that's really the tip that I would give you whenever you're launching a program.
Okay. Well, in relation to the training curriculum and the program, you mentioned some of this already, but do you incorporate real world events and emerging threats into the curriculum? And if not, like, how do you ensure that it remains relevant and impactful? Because I imagine you kind of have to balance like the going with like a scare tactic or taking a cautionary approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the two primary components of a security awareness program is the assessment side, things like phishing simulations, vishing, et cetera, and then the training side. And both of those really can incorporate the real world threats. When you think about phishing, being able to replicate real world phishing emails is super important, right? You don't want to send people last year's threats. And so one of the things that we've done is that Terranova has done is we're getting intel from our security operations center. We have a lot of intel from companies that report suspicious emails through one of our sister companies. And we're able to get that information and actually create simulations out of it. And so we're able to provide phishing simulation templates that are based on real world threats. And that's super important to do. A lot of times what we see is that some phishing threats will get sent to a small group of users, not the entire employee base. Mostly, so that emails are more likely to get delivered when it's sent to a small set of users. And if you can take those phishing emails and you can turn that into a simulation, you can inoculate the entire audience, your entire organization, because they will have seen the phishing threat in the form of a simulation ahead of time. And so they're prepared for that and they're able to identify it. And so, when it comes to any assessment, you want to replicate real world threats as a form of inoculation against them. Same thing when it goes to the training. You want to be able to be flexible with your training curriculum. As things change, you want to be able to adapt to it. Recently we've seen a big push for training around artificial intelligence, AI. A lot of companies are implementing AI policies, and they need their employees to know the risk of it, right? I've read some interesting news stories where companies have announced data breaches because people have incorrectly used AI. They've put a lot of sensitive information into ChatGPT or whatever the AI tool is, and that's definitely a no-no. And so as technology changes, we have to adapt with it. So we need to be able to have a curriculum that can be flexible. And it kind of goes back to the idea that I said before, just the idea that an annual training program is really insufficient. It's too rigid and expects you to cover a lot of information that is going to last. Where if you have an ongoing training program, maybe that's monthly, maybe it's quarterly, you can adapt your training content as it's coming up based on what you're seeing. And so I think that's where, the benefit of working with Terranova Security is that we're able to create content really quickly, and we're able to keep up those threats so that you don't have to. And so, so you definitely want to incorporate the real world threats in your training curriculum as well as your assessments.
Okay, yeah, I want to talk about some of that content creation that you just mentioned there, because there's no question people are, I would say, attracted to interactive content, especially when there's tasks and rewards involved. How does adding game mechanics to your training modules sort of enhance the learning and retention?
Yeah, the way I think about it is if people are worried about their legs going to sleep, they're not going to be learning. And so people don't learn when they're bored. And someone in finance may not get super excited about cybersecurity, but it really is still important for them. And so gamification allows you to increase the engagement in the training material, and it also promotes active learning, right? So the more senses that you get involved, the more information is going to be retained. And so that's really important. And so gamification can really go beyond the course, right? So you can have courses that replicate arcade games or have kind of a choose your own adventure type style where the course is a little bit different depending on what you choose, having it reactive. And those are all great components and features of the Terranova content, but really can go beyond that, right? So creating friendly competition between departments is a really good way to increase the participation, right? So when you start talking about your department has the highest failure rate in a simulation, or your department has the lowest completion rate in a simulation, tends to motivate employees to be a little more participatory and get managers involved as well. And so, yeah, anything you can do to make it more interesting really is key. So good content with game mechanics is great. And then also going beyond that and creating friendly competition between different business units and departments is another way to get people more involved. And the more involved they are, the more they're going to learn. And then the more they learn, obviously, the more effective your program is going to be.
Okay, yeah, no, the competitive aspect is definitely relevant. I mean, I'm a very competitive person, and so if I were facing off against a different department in my company, maybe I would probably take the training even more seriously. Also, maybe if there was like a Amazon reward card or gift card or something too, I mentioned like little incentives like that probably help. Now, all those things that all definitely makes sense. It helps inspire employees, but I feel like there's always outliers that don't take these training sessions seriously, and as a result, that opens up businesses to more threats. These employees themselves really become a vulnerability for the business. How do you recommend organizations handle these employees who just continue to exhibit risky behavior and just not take their training seriously?
Yeah, I've seen companies handle this a wide variety of ways. I've worked with organizations that have a three strikes you're out. They will actually terminate employees if they fall for three phishing emails, simulation specifically because that's what we were tracking. But and I've also seen clients that will actually prevent people from getting a raise or being eligible to move into a new role within the organization if they're not doing their training and they're failing simulations. And so there are a lot of different sticks that you can use for that, and so it definitely takes a balanced approach for every organization based on your culture and what you're trying to foster. And so it's definitely a very you have to be very careful in that and how you do it. But some things that I would always recommend doing is if you have people that are failing consistently, repeatedly, people that are exhibiting that risky behavior, is first look at your program and see if there's things that you can do. Are you providing them adequate training? Are you actually giving them the information they need to be successful? And then when you are doing phishing assessments, for example, right, that's one of the big areas where we see organizations struggling is people that are continuing to fail phishing simulations. Making sure you're providing that instant feedback in the moment when they actually fail is crucial to help them learn from their mistakes. Outside of that, you really need to have kind of a remedial training program or an escalation process to be able to help people that are struggling, right? So assuming you've got the basics done, you've got a good program, it's giving them the information they need, you're giving them that just-in-time training when they do fail simulations so they can learn from their mistakes. Outside of that, I would definitely recommend having an intensive remediation training program. So giving them that more in-depth training. And that could be done through computer-based training modules, or it could be done personally. So I've seen organizations, they will actually escalate to their managers after the second failure and have the managers provide them training. And then the third failure, it's sitting down with the CISO and getting training from them, which is not really where you want to be. And so that kind of ties into the next point, which is making sure you have an escalation process and you're aware of that. This is one of those things that I would definitely recommend partnering with your human resources, people experience departments to make sure that there's alignment between that. But you need to be able to understand your posture towards failing phishing simulations or not taking training, and then be able to react accordingly. I'm aware of a client, Terranova client, that will actually remove access to the network if you're not taking your training. And so you really do have to take it seriously in order to be able to prevent the threats. If you have a program that simply says, here's some training, we want you to take it, or here's a simulation, but there are no consequences to it, then really it's not going to change anyone's behavior because they're not going to be invested in participating. So that's really key. And then to your point about the rewards and things like that. So there's definitely the stick side of things where you can threaten, you can keep them from getting raises, terminate them, whatever it is. But I would definitely recommend using the carrot side of things as well. So providing positive reinforcement for those that are doing well, giving recognition to people that are doing well. Who are your top reporters? What departments have the highest report rate, lowest failure rate, things like that. Making sure to call them out, giving gift cards for people. The company I worked for in the past, they had a drawing every month during the company meetings for the people that reported the simulation in the previous month, right? They would actually get a gift card. And so it actually made people more invested in it. And so there's a carrot side of that as well. And so it's definitely something that you have to balance. Partnering with HR ahead of time is always better than after the fact. And so that's definitely something I would recommend planning and preparing for, because it will happen. And so assess your program, partner with the human resources team to make a good escalation path, and then also make sure to reward people that are doing well.
Now, what about the role of teamwork and collaboration? Like, how do you think regular communication between security ops and the training teams can boost like the overall success of a security program?
Yeah, so I mean, when it goes to the previous point about getting collaboration or getting people to actually take it seriously and to do better, communication between departments is key, right? What we don't want to have happen is have a cybersecurity awareness program that's a silo. That's kind of this thing that you have to do that no one wants to talk about it, no one cares about. You want to have people excited about it, and so going back to the idea of a carrot, that's really key. Operationally or tactically, when it comes to, a lot of times the people that I'm working with are the cybersecurity teams, and so they've got their finger on the pulse, and that's great, right? So they know the threats that they're facing. They see the tickets that are getting raised. They see the phishing emails, the real phishing attacks that are coming in, and so they've got a good sense of that. So if you're an organization where you've been tasked with handling the simulations or the training, you've got to partner with the other organizations, the security team, for example, to make it effective. Operationally, you definitely want to know the SecOps team or whoever, the help desk, whoever handles escalations, know when you're doing a simulation or even a training ahead of time so that they're prepared. But then more strategically, more importantly, is making sure you understand the concerns the SecOps teams is facing. And then that will allow you to be adaptive. It'll allow you to train to the current threats. It'll help you, like we talked about before, creating phishing emails that replicate real attacks. And then, ultimately, it'll help you increase the awareness through other communication methods as well. And so, communication is key, and definitely one of the biggest challenges that we've seen across organizations is the lack of communication, and treating security awareness training as kind of a problem that you have to put aside or you have to tolerate.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about like tying in a company's own culture? Because, how do you, every culture is different. So how do you go about blending security training with other company learning programs, or maybe tying it into the broader company culture?
Yeah. So I think really that's where it comes from. The leadership of an organization really sets the tone for how important security awareness training is, and genuinely, not to self-aggrandize, but security awareness training is super important. Every employee has access to your network and has access to the internet, and those two things can be very problematic when mixed incorrectly. And so, if you aren't promoting cybersecurity in an organization, if you're not talking about it, if you're not making it important, people are not going to take it important. So when I've seen companies do things where it becomes a center point for their meetings and their discussions and their culture, and they do a really good job, and it's something they take very seriously. And I've seen on the other side of the scale companies who just look at it as the annual compliance, check the box, and we see far more success, of course, with those that are actually communicating about it. So a client of ours, they always talk. I mentioned this. They always talk about the simulation results in every monthly meeting. They had the raffle for people who were reporting simulation emails. In fact, they actually went beyond from a metrics perspective. They looked at someone who took no action on a simulation as just as bad as having failed a simulation, because they were really fostering a community or a culture that reporting was critical. We know that there's no silver bullet for security. A lot of times security is like playing a game of whack-a-mole as you're trying to adapt to the threats. Some things are going to get through. And if you're not crowdsourcing the threats from your employees, then you're missing a huge opportunity. And so getting them involved is critical. And the way this company really, we're encouraging people to report and in fact telling people that they failed a simulation because they did not report a simulation, really fostered the idea that if anything got through their defenses, then they were going to find out about it because they had their employees were on the ball and they were paying attention to what was going on and they were reporting everything. And so very big difference from companies that don't do that. And so, and then going beyond that, again, making it part of your culture, making sure cybersecurity communication is really part of your normal communications, whether that's your all hands meetings, whether that's newsletters, things of that nature. You want to make sure it's top of mind, right? So when it comes to marketing, you want to make sure you have lots of exposure so that people remember it. And so that's really what it comes down to.
Okay, well, thanks for that breakdown and all that great information there and the real world examples you mentioned. I want to take a step back and kind of look at the industry as a whole, because I'm a big picture guy. I love just learning more about various industries, especially from people like yourself who, have inside knowledge and your own unique perspective. So what are some of the trends or innovations you're most excited about, and how do you think they'll shape the future of cybersecurity education?
Yeah, for sure. From a trend perspective, one of the things that I enjoy, that I'm excited about, is the fact that cybersecurity is becoming more mainstream. When I remember seeing the movies Hackers a long time ago, and it was kind of its own little novel thing. But now we see television shows. I was watching a show the other day, and they were talking about a ransomware attack at a law firm, and we're talking about phishing emails. And so, as people are becoming more aware of the cyber threats, we see that the cybersecurity is becoming more mainstream. It's becoming more critical parts of our stories, of our plots, and so people understand it more. So it becomes more part of their vocabulary, and they're not afraid of it. And so that's excellent. And so that definitely it reduces the barriers from a cybersecurity awareness program. Being able to communicate with people more easily, and instead of having to first define vocabulary so you understood each other, you can just have a conversation about it. So I think that's great. Other things that I'm excited about, of course, as people are more and more relying on their phones, we see that training content is becoming more accessible, and so that's great. Giving people the ability to take training where they are and on the tools that they use is fantastic. So the more mobile compatibility is great. We've also seen a lot of advancements in content. So AI has enabled content to be produced more quickly and also be tailored more easily. So being able to have content that is more relevant and more pertinent to your organization than, say, just your typical business. A lot of universities, for example, some of the out of the box training doesn't really account for the university space, for example. And nowadays, with a variety of different tools we have available, we see that we're able to be more flexible with the content. And so I think that cybersecurity training is one of those things that there's a lot of potential, especially with the advances in technology, especially with the advances in AI. And I think there's a lot of good things to come.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how governments react to AI and the increasing focus on data privacy. I think that's a huge issue. And at least in the U.S., I feel like we kind of just let things develop on their own until we have any sort of comprehensive regulations around it, for better or worse, I suppose. I do think we're at another sort of fundamental shift akin to like the advent of the internet. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the ripple effect of this technology. I do have a couple more questions for you. And this might give you a chance to sort of rehash some of the points you already mentioned around cybersecurity training. Now, if I were an organization starting to build my own security awareness program, what advice would you give me to address the various threats that are out there in today's world?
Yeah. I think we touched on some of these points, but it's definitely worth rehashing kind of in this specific framework. So, first and foremost, you have to establish a vision for your program. So, what are you trying to accomplish? So it goes back to knowing your employees, knowing what you need to, why you're doing a program, and what you need to train on. Every organization's at a different place. That's one of the things that I really enjoy about my role, being able to work with companies that are just starting out. They've never done a program, to companies that have been doing very advanced cybersecurity awareness programs for years, and their employees are very well trained. And so, it's okay to be where you're at, right? So, uh, take it as a crawl, walk, run program. You might just be starting out with your annual trainings, but over time, you can do annual trainings with assessments, and then recurring training, and then recurring assessments. And as you mature, you can even do things like getting a security ambassadors. That's one of the benefits of working with a partner like Terranova, is the fact that we have expertise in building security awareness programs, and we can give you that advice. I've seen clients that have tried to do this on their own. Again, buying that idea of, I'm going to buy some software that is going to allow me to do a security awareness program, and then it just gets unused. So it becomes shelfware, and we don't want that to happen. And so we want to partner with you to help you do that. So investing in a good partner is one of those keys. Once you understand what your vision is, so that you can get to where you need to be more quickly.
What about mistakes to avoid? Like, do you have any real world examples of common mistakes that you've seen organizations make in their programs? And if so, like, how has it impacted them, and what could they have done maybe to prevent it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest mistakes I've seen involve around communication and inadequate resources. When it comes to resources, again, the idea of shelfware, where organizations will buy software, they'll buy licenses to a tool, they have plans to use it, but you're giving the responsibility to execute to a person who's already fully loaded, whose responsibilities are already all consuming. And so that can be a big problem. Solution to that would be, outsourcing that management effort to a company like Terranova, partnering with a company like Terranova to help provide expertise so that you don't have to make mistakes on your own. Going back to your idea of lack of support and leaders that aren't buying in. I had a company. This is a multinational company, very large name brand that you would recognize. They decided that they weren't going to tell their managers or their employees about a phishing simulation program. And so we would spend tons of time preparing simulations, testing, making sure everything was working correctly. And then we would launch the simulation. And it never failed for about a year. Every time we launched a simulation, I would get a call saying, we got to stop the simulation. Someone's upset about it. The managers, because they didn't know, when they would get this email that says, and then they're told, oh, you've been phished, they would get upset about it, and they would complain. They would complain to the food chain until ultimately the decision was made to stop. So wasted tons of time. And so that's where, when it comes to launching a good program, make sure your leaders are involved and they're endorsing and supporting the program. This needs to be something that's publicly expressed by the leaders so that everyone is on board. And so definitely want to do that as well.
I just picture like you making the call of, we got to stop the simulation, and I'm picturing like Black Mirror episodes, or I actually just watched Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind last night, and that has there's some parallels with that. But maybe that's just my mind going on a tangent. But I think that there's a lot of great information that you shared, and I hope people are taking notes, because I think people are just going to take security awareness training a lot more seriously after listening to this podcast. With that said, for those interested in Terranova security and want to connect with you and your team, where should they go?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, of course, reach our website. The website is fortra.com, or you can email me personally. My email is dane.boyd@fortra.com. Love to continue the conversation, and appreciate the opportunity to meet with you.
Awesome. All right. Well, those are all the questions I have for you today. I really appreciate you taking the time, sit down with us, talk all about cybersecurity awareness training. Thank you, Dane. Really appreciate it.
The pleasure is mine. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening to the SourceForge podcast. I'm your host, Bo Hamilton. Make sure to subscribe to stay up to date with all of our upcoming B2B software related podcasts. I will talk to you in the next one.